In your book, you talk about how you've both made the choice to be involved in local politics or local institutions. So, I'm thinking about things like the city council or the school board, the Rotary Club, the PTA, the HOA, the church. And you've talked about how that is really the natural training ground for navigating political disagreements. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, those are spaces where the people who are willing to do something have an extraordinary amount of influence. They are also places where you have to constantly observe the impact of your actions. National politics is tempting and can be a good distraction because you can get really hot about something and fire off a very sharply worded statement about it and never see the hurt that causes someone else or the damage that might transpire if everything you wanted came true. You don't have to see the impact. And locally, when you're operating in a church, and you're talking about anything as simple as like, should we repair this door or not? You are going to run up against the resistance of other humans and their priorities and see the direct result of how you have contributed. And it is an incredibly humbling experience and an eye-opening experience. And I think it really is the work of being a human who's growing and developing over time.
Yeah, I had an experience of this recently. We had David French on the podcast, and I was trying to give him some examples to talk to Christians about how to navigate issues. And I brought up an example of a decision that was made by our school board. And one of the school board members in town reached out to me afterwards really nicely. And we had this amazing 2-hour conversation about that issue and why he voted the way he voted and the discussion that he had. But it highlighted for me the exact point that you made, which is it's easy to talk about things, even on a podcast, and forget that has impacts on real life people. The beauty of that was if I was talking about some school board off in California where I don't live, no one would have ever reached out and said, hey, can we have a conversation about that? The beauty is that because it was in my town, we got to have a really productive conversation with one another. And I had to reflect on, hey, maybe I got some things wrong here. Maybe I misunderstood some details and even changed my mind on a few issues. There was a real beauty there. So how has your experience in local politics, local institutions, how has it helped you navigate disagreement? I mean, what advice would you give to someone who's maybe doing this for the first time and they know I'm going to come up against disagreement with the people who are in the room with me? How do you navigate that?
I ran for city commission in my town. I served a single term. And, what I learned really even before I ran, because I was such an outwardly political person, is how hungry people are to engage, not just fight, not just argue, not debate, but engage. This stuff is important to people, especially as more of our politics is driven by identity. And they want to feel heard and they want to feel seen. That's true of humans in most situations, including in church congregations. And so I think that just keeping that at the center of your sort of vision and scope as you engage with people, like this person wants to feel seen and they want to feel heard, just like I do, is really, really important, because I think we get on the defensive or, we have some goals in mind, or we forget that the most we can do is influence each other, not control one another. And we just lose sight of that. And then we get adrift and then we get defensive and then they get defensive and there can be shame involved. And that really shuts the conversation down. And if we can just keep that sort of responsive instead of reactive energy that they want to feel seen and heard like I do, it can go a long way.
My experience is more concentrated in business and the nonprofit space than in the civic space. And I love being in civic spaces and nonprofit spaces because unlike business, where you kind of bring this mindset of we can't make everyone happy, we just have to make a decision that advances our strategy and go. When you're in a church or you're in a town hall or a PTA meeting, that's just not the truth of it. It's true that not everyone will be happy, but everyone does belong. And it's not a situation where it's like, well, if you don't like it, there's the door. We'll hire someone who can replace you. We have to continue on together. And local spaces are a really good reminder that we have to continue on together. We have to be able to figure it out.
Man, I feel like it would be so much healthier for our national discourse if we talked online the way we talk at a church meeting or at the PTA or whatever organizations we're talking about, as though we're talking to real people who are sitting across the table and, like you guys said, have feelings. One of my concerns is I think about these institutions being being the natural training ground for navigating disagreement is that part of me fears that you have to have a certain level of privilege to participate in these kinds of things. And here's what I mean. Generally speaking, you have to have a certain amount of free time, which you might not have if you're working multiple jobs. Depending on the institution, like you think about PTAs, HOAs, access to those things requires that you live in certain neighborhoods. And so you have to have a certain socioeconomic level. And why I bring that up is it means that in those institutions, it often means that the people who are sitting there might be some diversity of thought, but there might not be socioeconomic diversity simply, again, because of the fact that hey, I don't have the time to do this, or I don't live in that neighborhood or this area where we have these kinds of conversations. So how do you guys navigate that? I mean, what do you do for people who they're like, yeah, I would love to be a part of these things, but I can't because of my life?
I mean, that's something we can't control on an individual level. Our systems are built in a way that really rewards that sort of access. Even my run for city commissioner, it was a part-time position. It paid very little, and it took enormous time and energy for me to get elected. And money that I was able to do only really because my husband had a good, well-paying job, and I had the flexibility of being sort of a part-time stay-at-home mom, part-time social media consultant, and baby new podcaster, right? And so, that's true of so many of our state legislators that are part-time gigs, like that nobody could really do if they had a full-time 9-to-5 job. And so I think there's some real structural things we need to look at as Americans at both the local, state, and national level about that sort of access and the resources that are required to not only run for public office, but to win and then to actually govern. And I think that there are things that can be done. And again, it's like, is that your work to do? Is that something that fires you up? Do you feel some like reform solutions that are available to you? They happen. Like we were just talking the other day that one thing that would really help in our winner take all system, and I think could trickle down into the types of people that run, is ranked choice voting.
Yeah.
And when we started talking about that on our podcast, it was like a gleam in somebody's eye. And now you have full-on states doing it. Alaska's doing it. Like it is getting worked out. They are figuring out how this works in a lot of places across the country. And that's very, very encouraging to me. And also a reminder of what old podcasters we are and how long we've been at this. But what I've been saying a lot is like, there's no stasis in American politics. Whatever you think the problem is, the issue is, like, we're going to work on it. I mean, think about back in the early 1900s when it was like state legislators picking senators. That was in the Constitution. We had to pass an amendment to open up greater access to those particular political offices and make it less of a sort of elite election. I'm using the term election very loosely. And we did it. We did it as Americans. We worked through that during the progressive era, and we made some of those big changes, and we'll continue to do that. We'll continue to work on these things and open it up to more and more people, because I think you're right. It is definitely a socioeconomic issue right now.
But one thing you can do at the individual level, I totally agree with Sarah, it's a systems issue, but at the individual level, one thing you can do is be the person who says, who's not in this meeting who should be here? Who's not being considered right now? Whose perspective have we missed as we've talked about this, and how can we get that perspective here? Even if these folks who we are missing cannot sit on the board with us, how can we engage them more effectively? And sometimes it's saying, you know what, I'm going to decline that board seat. I know someone who would be fantastic, and I'm going to go to them and help you recruit them and see how I can support them being in this position.
Yeah, that's great. This is one of my apologetics, defenses, if you will, of the church. And I don't want to paint an overly idealistic picture with what I'm about to say, because of course we could think of churches that don't fit this model. But a healthy church that's doing what it's supposed to do should actually have a lot of socioeconomic diversity inside of it. And it should be putting people alongside each other, business owners and single moms who are coming from very different parts of the world. And I think that one of the costs of the decline of the institution of the church, especially in rural and poorer areas of the country, is that people lost an institution where they could have a sense of belonging and voice and shaping what's happening around them. I mean, this goes back to the Donald Trump phenomenon in some ways. I mean, the areas that were most likely to nominate him in the primary were primarily these areas where actually the church had kind of evaporated and there wasn't a lot of institutional trust. Do you guys think that the church can play a significant role in helping training people for disagreement and helping reduce anxiety by giving them places where they can actually have a voice and change what's happening around them?
What do you mean by church?
I'd say church writ large.
That word's doing a lot of work there. Yes. Do I think that Christians who, subscribe to certain tenets of faith can be the church out there and show that to people? Absolutely. Do I think some institutions that describe themselves as the church are doing the exact opposite? Absolutely. That word's doing a lot of work there. All I can do is tell you in my experience, I've had both good and bad wrapped up in that word, even inside the same congregation. I grew up Southern Baptist, and in some ways I learned at that place that I did have a sense of belonging, that people were looking out for me, that they were invested in me, that they were protecting me. And then I also received some really harmful messages, particularly around sexuality and even politics and like women in leadership. And now I'm in a different church congregation where I do, think that it offers me that sense that there's a net. Not only that I belong, but that there are people that are there holding me and my children. And you can hear the emotion in my voice because that's incredibly beneficial. And I see that absence in other people's lives, in my family and my friends. And I want that for them. But I think it's really complicated. And many of us in the faith and many of us who consider ourselves of the church and many institutions that describe themselves as the church, we have a lot of work to do with people.
Beth, anything you would add to that?
My church is definitely the most diverse place that I spend time along about every dimension. And I particularly value the generational diversity in church. There are not a lot of places where you get to have kids and senior citizens together and everyone in between, lots of different life experiences put in one place, lots of different abilities, lots of different ways that you can be a family under one roof. And I really do value that. So yes, I think the church can serve us tremendously in this respect. I worry, though, that when I say that, it sounds like churches should be rolling out some new program to get at it. And the way that I think church can be most impactful in our politics is really to give more people that sense of belonging and that sense that I am known here and I am cared for here. And that is an intimacy that I don't think you can program. I think it really is just the heart of the church and the people who attend it and their intention to know and care for one another. It's a much bigger lift than rolling out, how the church can heal the American Divide 101. Like, it would be easier to come up with some curriculum that we all start doing. But I think the harder work ahead of us is that sense of belonging for all of the diverse people who gather.
I'm Patrick. Thanks for watching this video. If you're passionate about ending tribalism in the church and giving Jesus your allegiance, you're not alone. We have a podcast and a book. They're both called Truth Over Tribe. You can download the podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can buy the book on Amazon. I hope you'll check them out.